The second time Vivian asked me to be her husband for 3 hours, I was sitting across from her at a corner table at Luca's on Clifton Avenue with a glass of wine I had no intention of drinking. And she was wearing the same black dress and the same pearl earrings, and she was holding the same pen. A blue ballpoint, the kind you buy in a 12-pack at the drugstore, the kind that doesn't look like anything but is the most dangerous object in the room when someone knows what to do with it. And she was sliding the same marriage license across the table with the same expression on her face, which was an expression I'd spent 11 months learning to read, and which I now understood was not warmth, not intimacy, not the look of a woman falling in love, but the look of a locksmith studying a lock. I know how that sounds. I know. But I'm not going to explain it, because the explanation wouldn't change what I did with that pen. What matters is that I had 11 months. 11 months between the morning I woke up on the bathroom floor of my apartment on Harker Street with the taste of almonds and something chemical. Potassium chloride, I'd learn later, the compound that stops a heart without leaving a bruise. Coating the back of my throat, and this Thursday evening at Luca's, when Vivian slid the license across the table and I picked up the pen and I did not sign. If you're new here, welcome back to Elena's Rebirth life, where betrayal never gets the final word. I need to tell you about the first time, the time that ended with me on a bathroom floor with my hand 4 inches from my phone and my chest feeling like someone had parked a car on it. My name is Daniel Rowe. I was 33 when I met Vivian. I am an architect. I founded Rowe Design Studio 6 years ago, a small firm, 12 people, specializing in residential and small commercial work. We'd done 47 projects. I'd built my name on one thing. I read every line of every contract before I signed it. I checked every number. I caught an error in a contractor's insurance certificate once, a transposed digit in the policy number that would have voided our coverage on a $2.3 million project. And my project manager said, "You have the most expensive eyes in the business, Dan." That was the thing people knew about me. I was careful. I was thorough. I read everything. Except the things Vivian handed me, because by the time she was handing me things, I wasn't reading anymore. I was just signing. Was Vivian Chen. She walked into my office on a Tuesday in March. She was a real estate developer, or she said she was, and she had a project. A mixed-use building on the east side, 12 units over ground floor retail, and she wanted an architect who understood light. That's what she said. Who understands light? She'd seen the reading room I'd designed for the Whitfield Branch Library, the one with the south-facing windows that threw a trapezoid of gold across the floor from September through March, and she said I'd been thinking about how light moves through a building, and I want someone who thinks about it too. She was articulate. She was specific. She used the word trapezoid. Nobody uses the word trapezoid unless they've stood in that room and watched the light. And she had, and she'd noticed, and I thought, this is a person who sees what I see. We worked together for 4 months. The project moved fast. She was decisive. She made choices about materials, finishes, layouts, in the time it took most clients to choose a paint color. She brought coffee to meetings, not the generic kind. She'd noticed I drank black coffee, no sugar, and she brought it from a place on Clifton Avenue that roasted their own beans. And the coffee was good, and the cup was warm in my hand, and she'd sit across from me, and we'd talk about the building and about light and about the way a room changes when the sun moves. And somewhere around month 3, I stopped thinking of her as a client and started thinking of her as someone I wanted to be in a room with. She told me about herself in pieces, the way people do when they're letting you in slowly. She'd grown up in a city 200 miles east. Her parents had died. Car accident, she was 17. She'd built herself from nothing. She had a development company called Meridian Ventures. She had an office on Industrial Row, a converted warehouse with exposed brick and large windows. She said she'd chosen it because the afternoon light came through the west windows at an angle that made the brick glow. She was a person who noticed light. That was the hook. That was the thing I kept coming back to. She notices the same things I notice. She sees what I see. She must be real. There were details I should have caught. She said she'd gone to a university for architecture and dropped out after 2 years. Said she preferred building to drawing, development to design. I didn't check. I could have called the registrar. I could have asked for a transcript. I was an architect. I verified subcontractors' licenses before I let them touch my projects. But Vivian wasn't a subcontractor. Vivian was a woman who brought me coffee and said trapezoid. And I didn't verify her because verifying her would have felt like an accusation. And I didn't want to accuse her of anything because accusing her of anything would have meant admitting I didn't trust her. And admitting I didn't trust her would have meant sitting alone in my apartment again with a microwave dinner and a set of blueprints, which is what I'd been doing for 4 years, and I was tired of it. Loneliness is a structural deficiency. It doesn't show on the outside, but it compromises the foundation and everything built on top of it. Every judgment, every decision, every signature is compromised by the weight of wanting someone to be real. She wasn't real. Meridian Ventures was a shell. The office on Industrial Row was sublet from a graphic design firm that occupied it 3 days a week. The development project and the 12-unit building existed only in the renderings my studio had produced. There was no land purchase, there was no financing, there was no building. There was a woman who had studied me, what I looked at, what I noticed, what I valued, and had built herself into the shape of the person I'd be most likely to trust. I didn't know any of that. I knew that she brought me coffee and talked about light, and that her hand touched mine when we leaned over the same drawing, and that her skin smelled like bergamot and something warmer underneath. Vanilla, maybe, or just the warmth of a person who is close to you. And I was 33 and I'd been single for 4 years, and I was the kind of careful that has a cost, which is loneliness. And loneliness makes you stupid in ways that caution can't protect you from. She asked me to marry her in July. Not the way people usually ask, not on a knee, not with a ring. She said she needed a favor. She said her visa was expiring. She said she'd been in the country for 6 years on an H-1B, and her employer had gone under, and her status was in jeopardy, and she needed to marry a citizen to stay. She said she was asking me because she trusted me, and because she didn't want to ask a stranger, and because it would be, she used this phrase, just paperwork. 3 hours at the courthouse, a signature, a license. She said it would be the easiest thing I'd ever done. She said I'd be her husband for 3 hours, and then we'd go back to being whatever we were, and nobody had to know. I should have said no. I was a person who read contracts. I was a person who checked numbers. I knew that a marriage license wasn't paperwork. It was a legal contract that created joint property rights, joint tax liability, spousal privilege, and a dozen other entanglements that don't dissolve because you whispered just paperwork 3 times. I knew this. I'd read about it. I'd studied it. But I was sitting across from her, and she was holding the pen, and she was looking at me with an expression I now understand was not vulnerability, but precision. The precision of a person who has identified the load-bearing wall and is about to remove it. And I took the pen and I signed. The marriage license was filed on July 14th. We went to the courthouse on Clifton Avenue. The ceremony took 11 minutes. The judge said, "You may kiss the bride," and Vivian kissed me. Brief, warm, the bergamot and vanilla. And we walked out, and she said, "Thank you, Dan," and she squeezed my hand, and her hand was warm, and I thought, this is fine. This is just a thing I did for a person I care about. This is fine. It was not fine. The marriage license was the key, not to my heart, to my identity. Within 2 weeks, Vivian had used the marriage certificate to apply for a joint bank account at First National. My name was on the account. I'd signed the application. She'd brought it to me at the office. I'd signed it between meetings. I didn't read the terms because she'd said it was just for convenience, just so she could deposit the project funds. And the account gave her access to my personal checking, my savings, and the operating account for Row Design Studio. She'd checked a box on the application, 1 box. The box that said joint account holder authorized to access all linked accounts. I hadn't seen the box. I'd signed at the bottom. The pen was always right there. By August, she'd used the marriage certificate to request a replacement Social Security card in my name. She'd filled out the form. I know this because I later obtained the SS5 application from the Social Security Administration under a Freedom of Information Act request, and the application was in her handwriting, not mine, with my information copied from the marriage certificate. And the replacement card had been mailed to an address on Industrial Row that I'd never lived at. With the replacement card, she'd applied for a replacement driver's license. With the driver's license and the Social Security card and the marriage certificate, she'd opened 3 credit card accounts in my name. With the credit cards, she'd begun building a parallel identity. A version of Daniel Rowe, who lived at her address, received her mail, answered her phone, and was, for all legal and financial purposes, indistinguishable from me. I didn't notice. I was busy. The studio had 3 projects in construction. I was working 60-hour weeks. I was sleeping 5 hours a night. I was drinking the coffee she brought me and signing the things she asked me to sign, and I didn't check my credit. I didn't check my mail. She'd submitted a change of address form to the post office, redirecting my mail to the Industrial Row address. And I didn't notice because my mail had always been boring. Utility bills, trade magazines, the occasional catalog. And when it stopped coming, I thought I'd gone paperless on something and forgot. I didn't check my bank statements. I'd set up autopay for my rent and my studio expenses. And I checked the balance on my phone, which showed the total, not the transaction detail. And the total was declining, but slowly enough that I attributed it to the projects. I was an architect. I was trained to see structure. I was not trained to see theft because theft doesn't look like theft when it's done by someone who brings you coffee and smells like bergamot. I found out in October, 3 months after the courthouse, I was at the bank, First National, the branch on Clifton Avenue, trying to transfer $18,000 to a contractor for a project deposit, and the teller said, "Mr. Rowe, I'm showing some unusual activity on your account." And she printed a transaction log that was 14 pages long, and the log showed 47 transfers to an account at Meridian Trust in the name of Meridian Ventures, totaling $73,200, each transfer between $1,200 and $1,800, each one authorized by a joint account holder, Vivian Chen Rowe. She'd taken my last name. She had taken my last name at the courthouse, and I hadn't even noticed, because who reads the marriage license after they've signed it? She'd taken my last name and my money and my social security number and my credit, and she'd been building a second Daniel Rowe at an address I'd never been to. And I'd been drinking coffee. I drove to Industrial Row. The building was a converted warehouse, exposed brick, large windows, the afternoon light. There was a suite on the second floor with a door that said Meridian Ventures. I tried the handle. It was locked. I looked through the window. There was a desk, a phone, a filing cabinet, a framed copy of my architect's license, not a photocopy, the original, which she'd requested from the state licensing board using a forged letter on Rowe Design Studio letterhead, a letter I'd never written, signed with a signature that was close to mine but not mine. The same kind of simulation a tracer produces when they're trying too hard to be accurate. My license, on her wall, in her office, in a building I'd never entered. I stood at that window for a long time. The glass was cold. It was October, the wind had turned, and the glass had that particular coldness that old windows get, the kind where you can feel the outside pressing in. I could see my reflection in the glass, superimposed over the room, my face over the desk, my body over the filing cabinet, a ghost version of me standing in a room I'd never been in, surrounded by documents I'd never signed. I put my hand on the glass. The cold traveled up my fingers, into my wrist. I thought, she's been here, in this room, with my name on the wall, building a version of me that doesn't know she exists. And I've been at the studio drawing lines, drinking her coffee while she's been in this room becoming me. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table on Harker Street and I called the bank and froze the accounts. I called the Social Security Administration and reported the fraud. I called the 3 credit card companies. I didn't know which 3. I had to pull my credit report, which showed $42,800 in charges across 3 cards I'd never opened. And I disputed every charge. I called a lawyer. His name was Gerald Achebe, and he worked at a firm called Achebe & Stein on Clifton Avenue, and I brought him everything. The bank records, the credit report, the SS5 application, the change of address form, and he read it all, and he said, "Daniel, your wife has committed identity theft, bank fraud, credit fraud, and forgery, and the marriage was the vehicle." I said, "I know." He said, "We need to file a police report, a fraud report with the FTC, and a petition for annulment on the grounds of fraud." I said, "Do all of it." He said, "We also need to freeze your credit with all 3 bureaus." I said, "Do that too." He said, "When did you last see her?" I said, "This morning." She brought me coffee. The annulment petition was filed on October 17th. The police report was filed the same day. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Torres. Quiet, methodical, wrote everything in a notebook with a pen she clicked between entries. She asked me to describe every document Vivian had asked me to sign. I listed them: the marriage license, the joint bank account application, a power of attorney she'd said was for the project. I'd signed it in August, another document I hadn't read. A name change authorization she'd said was for updating her own documents after the marriage. I'd signed it in September. Torres wrote it all down. She said the power of attorney is the most dangerous one. I said, I know. She said, what does it authorize? I said, I don't know. I didn't read it. She looked at me the way you look at a building that's missing a load-bearing wall. She said, we'll find out. Gerald obtained a copy of the power of attorney from the county recorder. It was 4 pages, page 2, paragraph 3. The grant of authority included the right to sign documents, execute contracts, transfer assets, and conduct financial transactions on behalf of the principal. It was a general power of attorney, the broadest kind, and I'd signed it because Vivian had said it was for the project and because I trusted her and because the pen was always right there. The annulment hearing was scheduled for November 3rd. Gerald said the annulment would void the marriage retroactively, which would invalidate the joint accounts and the name change authorization. He said the power of attorney was separate. It survived the annulment unless I formally revoked it, and I'd already signed a revocation on October 17th, the same day I'd filed the police report. He said the identity theft was a criminal matter. He said the financial fraud was a civil matter. He said we'd pursue both. I was going to win. The evidence was overwhelming: the bank records, the credit report, the SS5 application in her handwriting, the forged letter to the licensing board, the power of attorney I'd revoked, the change of address form she'd submitted. Gerald said Vivian would likely be charged with identity theft, bank fraud, forgery, and obtaining property by false pretenses. He said the annulment was a formality. He said, Daniel, you're going to be fine. I wasn't fine. I was going to be dead in 14 days. October 30th, a Thursday. Vivian called me. I hadn't spoken to her since the police report. Her voice was calm, the same calm I'd heard when she talked about light, the same calm she'd worn at the courthouse, the same calm she'd worn every time she'd slid a document across a table. She said, Dan, I know you're upset. She said, I can explain everything. She said, can we meet? She said, I'll bring the documents. She said, I'll bring everything you need. She said, meet me at the apartment. Her apartment, the one on Industrial Row above the office. She said, 7 p.m. She said, I'll make dinner. I should have said no. Gerald said, don't meet her alone. Torres said, don't meet her alone. I said, she's going to hand over the documents. I said, it's easier if she cooperates. I said, she sounds reasonable. I was 33 and I'd been carefully, methodically, thoroughly robbed, and I was still the person who believed that if you just sat down and talked, people would do the right thing. I was the person who read contracts and couldn't read people, and I was about to walk into an apartment above a warehouse on Industrial Row, where a woman who had studied me the way I studied buildings had prepared a meal I was never meant to finish. The apartment was warm. She'd cooked pasta, the kind with the red sauce that smells like basil and tomato, and something underneath, something I couldn't place, something faintly bitter like burnt almond. She poured wine, red, the same Pinot Noir we'd had at Luca's the night she'd asked me to sign the license. She said, sit down, Dan. She said, eat. She said, I know I made mistakes. She said, I'll sign whatever you need. She said, I'll return everything. She said, I just want to make this right. She was wearing the black dress, the pearl earrings, the bergamot, the vanilla, the warmth. She was wearing every piece of the person she'd built for me, every detail she'd designed, and I sat down and I ate the pasta and I drank the wine and I didn't notice the bitter undertone because the basil was strong and the wine was good and I was tired and I wanted it to be over. I stood up to use the bathroom. I made it 4 steps. My legs went first, not weak, not wobbly, just gone like someone had cut the strings. Then my chest, the pressure, not pain, pressure, like a weight, like the building itself was sitting on my sternum. I hit the bathroom floor. The tile was cold, white, small, the hexagonal kind they use in old buildings. And I could feel the grout lines under my cheek, and I could smell the soap, the lavender soap in the dish by the sink, and I could hear Vivian's footsteps in the other room, getting closer, and I could hear her voice saying, Dan? Dan? In a tone that wasn't alarm, wasn't concern, but verification. The tone of someone checking whether a process is complete. She didn't call 911. She stood in the bathroom doorway. She looked at me the way I looked at blueprints, reading the structure, checking the load, assessing whether the thing was finished. She knelt down. She took my wallet. She took my phone. She took my keys, the keys to my apartment on Harker Street, the keys to the studio on Clifton Avenue, the keys to everything I owned. She went through my pockets. She found the revocation document, the one I'd signed on October 17th, the one that revoked the power of attorney, the one I'd been carrying in my jacket because I'd been planning to file it with the county recorder the next morning. She took it, she folded it, she put it in her pocket, she stood up, she walked out. I heard the apartment door close, I heard the lock turn. I lay on the bathroom floor and I could feel my heart, not beating, not stopping, but stuttering, the way an engine stutters before it dies, the rhythm irregular, the pressure building, and I could smell the lavender soap and the bitter almond and the bergamot. She'd been wearing it, the bergamot, the whole time, even now, even while she was taking my wallet and my phone and my keys and the document that would have saved me. And I thought, potassium chloride, the bitter almond, the heart. She'd put it in the pasta, she'd put it in the wine, she'd been dosing me for an hour, and I'd eaten every bite because I was tired. And I wanted it to be over, and because the food smelled like basil, and I'd trusted the basil the way I'd trusted the coffee and the light and the trapezoid and every other beautiful thing she'd designed for me. The last thing I felt was the cold tile. The last thing I thought was, I should have read the documents. I woke up on the bathroom floor of my apartment on Harker Street. Not Vivian's bathroom, mine. The tile was different, larger, square, gray, the kind I had chosen when I'd renovated the apartment 3 years ago, and the soap in the dish was the cedar soap I used, not lavender, and the room smelled like cedar and grout and nothing else. No bergamot, no almond, no basil. My phone was on the sink. I reached for it. The screen said December 12th, 6:03 a.m., 11 months before October 30th, 11 months before the bathroom floor, 11 months before the potassium chloride and the lock turning and the footsteps fading. I lay on the tile for a long time, the cedar soap, the gray grout, the cold. Not the cold of dying, but the cold of a bathroom floor in December. The ordinary cold, the cold that means you're alive and the heating bill is due. I pressed my hand flat against the tile, and I could feel the grout lines under my fingertips and the solidity and the cold, and I cried. The quiet kind. The kind where your body just lets go because it finally can. I cried until the tile was wet, and then I stopped, and I wiped my face with the back of my hand. And I stood up, and I looked at the bathroom, my apartment, my life, the life I'd already lost once. And I made a list. Number 1, Vivian. She wasn't in my life yet. In the first life, she'd walked into my office in March. It was December. I had 3 months before she appeared. 3 months to prepare, 3 months to build the thing she'd walk into. A studio that looked like the studio she'd targeted, a person who looked like the person she'd targeted, but with a foundation she couldn't see and a structure she couldn't dismantle. Number 2, the documents. Every document she'd asked me to sign, the marriage license, the bank application, the power of attorney, the name change authorization. I needed to understand what each one did and how she'd used it. I needed to build legal firewalls. I needed to restructure my assets so that no signature, no marriage, no power of attorney could touch them. Number 3, the evidence. In the first life, I'd found the fraud after it happened. In this life, I needed to catch it as it happened. I needed cameras, I needed recordings. I needed to let her build her shell, Meridian Ventures, the Industrial Row office, the forged licensing letter, and document every step because a fraud in progress is evidence, and a fraud completed is a crime, and I needed both. Number 4, the bathroom floor, the potassium chloride, the bitter almond. I needed to never eat anything Vivian Chen prepared for me. I needed to never be alone in a room with her without an exit. I needed to assume from the first moment I met her that she was going to try to kill me, and I needed to be the person who was ready. Number 5, the annulment, the revocation. In the first life, I'd signed the revocation on October 17th, and she'd taken it off my body on October 30th. In this life, the revocation would be filed with the county recorder the day I signed it, notarized, time-stamped, and beyond her reach. I called Gerald Achebe on December 13th. I'd found him in the first life through a referral from my project manager. His wife was a paralegal at Achebe and Stein, and she'd said, if you're going up against someone who knows the system, you need Gerald. In the first life, I hadn't called him until October, after the fraud was discovered and the damage was done. In this life, I called him in December, 3 months before Vivian appeared. Gerald was 49 with close-cropped hair and reading glasses he kept on a cord around his neck, and his office on Clifton Avenue smelled like coffee and old leather and the particular dry smell of legal paper. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, and I told him I was expecting a fraud. I didn't tell him about the dying. I told him I'd been researching identity theft and marriage fraud, and I'd identified a pattern of schemes targeting professionals in my industry: architects, engineers, developers. And I wanted to protect myself before it happened. Gerald looked at me. He didn't ask how I knew the fraud was coming. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to restructure my assets so they can't be reached through a marriage or a power of attorney. I want a revocable living trust that holds my studio shares, my intellectual property, and my personal assets, with me as sole trustee and a corporate co-trustee, a bank, not a person, that has to approve any transfer. I want a prenuptial clause in any future marriage license that explicitly voids joint property rights. I want my credit frozen at all 3 bureaus. I want 2-step verification on every account. And I want a forensic accountant on retainer." Gerald said that's a lot of protection for someone who hasn't been attacked yet. I said I'd rather have it and not need it. He said, "Fair enough." He set up the trust, he froze the credit, he configured the verifications. He brought in the forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Mireille Adiemi, who'd worked on 14 identity theft cases and who spoke about financial fraud the way I spoke about load-bearing walls, with a respect for the structure of the thing. March came. Vivian walked into my office on Clifton Avenue. The same Tuesday, the same black dress, the same pitch about the mixed-use building, the same word, trapezoid. She'd done her research. She knew about the Whitfield Library. She knew about the reading room. She'd built the same persona, the developer who noticed light, the woman who brought coffee, the person who saw what I saw. She sat across from me, and she was articulate and specific and warm. And I looked at her, and I saw the same thing I'd seen the first time. A person who noticed the things I noticed. And I also saw what I hadn't seen the first time: the precision, the locksmith, the load-bearing wall. There was a moment I need to tell you about, when she first brought the coffee. It was the 3rd meeting. She set the cup on my desk, a paper cup, no lid, the coffee black, steam rising. And the smell hit me, not the coffee, the bergamot. Her hand was near the cup, and the bergamot was on her skin, and it mixed with the coffee, and for a second, just a second, less than a second, the width of a breath, I was on the bathroom floor, I was on the tile, the cold was in my cheek, the almonds were in my throat, the bergamot was over me, and then the second passed, and I was at my desk, and the coffee was steaming, and Vivian was smiling, and I picked up the cup, and I held it. I held it to look like I was drinking, the way you hold a glass at a party when you don't want to drink, and I set it down without touching my lips to the rim. She didn't notice. She was already talking about fenestration. She never noticed what I did with the coffee. She never noticed what I did with anything. That was her flaw. She'd studied me so carefully, my work, my habits, my loneliness, that she'd forgotten to study whether I might change. I played the part. I took the project. I drank the coffee. I accepted it. I held it. I let it warm my hands. And I set it down and didn't drink it. I let her sit close. I let her touch my hand over the drawings. I let the 4 months unfold the way they'd unfolded before, the materials meetings, the finish selections, the conversations about light. And I recorded every conversation, a pen recorder, the kind Gerald's investigator had given me, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket. I recorded her talking about the project, about herself, about her company. I recorded the specific lies: the office on Industrial Row, sublet, Meridian Ventures, a shell, the development project, non-existent. I photographed the business cards she gave me. I photographed the letterhead. I saved every email. In June, I hired a private investigator named Priya Desai, the same woman who'd later install cameras in the Vane Tower. Though that's a different story, a different life. Priya was former FBI 36, with a voice like a closed door and a habit of writing everything in a small notebook. I asked her to investigate Vivian Chen. I said I need to know who she is, not who she says she is, who she is. Priya took the assignment. She came back in 3 weeks with a file. Vivian Chen was not Vivian Chen. Her legal name was Wei Mingtan. She'd been born in a city 200 miles east. That part was true. Her parents had not died in a car accident. They were alive. They ran a dry cleaning business. She'd changed her name at 24, obtained a false social security number through a document broker in Westbrook, and had been operating under the Vivian Chen identity for 7 years. In those 7 years, she'd been involved in 3 previous marriage fraud schemes. 3 different men, 3 different cities, 3 different sets of forged documents and drained accounts. The first man, a pharmacist in Westbrook, had lost $89,000 and his pharmacy license. The second, a software developer 200 miles north, had lost $140,000 and spent 18 months disputing fraudulent credit accounts. The third, a contractor in a town I'd never heard of, had died. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. The case was closed, no investigation, no autopsy, no toxicology. A 38-year-old contractor who'd married Vivian Chen 11 months earlier had died of sudden cardiac arrest, and nobody had checked for potassium chloride. Priya said the contractor's name was Martin Hale. She said she'd requested the autopsy records. There were no autopsy records. The death certificate listed natural causes. She said the pattern was identical: meeting, courtship, marriage license, joint accounts, power of attorney, identity theft, and then, when the victim discovered the theft and threatened to go to the police, death. 3 men, 2 survived, 1 didn't. She said you'd be the 4th. I looked at the file. Martin Hale's face looked back at me. A photograph from his contractor's license, 41 years old, square jaw, the expression of a man who'd spent his life building things. He looked like me, not physically, structurally. He was a person who'd built something and trusted someone and died on a bathroom floor. I closed the file. My hands were steady. I said, what do I do? Priya said, you let her proceed, you let her build the fraud, you document every step. And when she makes her move, the marriage license, the bank application, the power of attorney, you don't sign. You let her think you will, you let her plan. And then when the trap is set, you spring it in a way she can't escape. July came. Vivian asked me to marry her. The same ask, the same visa story, the same just paperwork, the same pen, the blue ballpoint, the drugstore 12-pack. We were at Luca's, the same corner table, the same wine. She slid the license across the table. I looked at it. I looked at her. I picked up the pen. I held it. I could feel the plastic, warm from her hand, light, the lightest thing in the room. I said, Vivian, before I sign this, I want to talk about something. She said, sure. I said, I want to talk about Martin Hale. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Her face didn't change, not immediately, but the water changed. The surface tension broke. I could see it in the way her fingers shifted on the wine glass, the way her left thumb pressed against the stem, the way the smile stayed, but the eyes behind it went flat. She said, who? I said, Martin Hale, the contractor, the one who died of cardiac arrest 11 months after marrying a woman named Vivian Chen in a courthouse in a town 200 miles north. I said, I know your name is Wei Ming Tan. I know about the document broker in Westbrook. I know about the pharmacist and the software developer. I know about the 3 previous marriage licenses and the 3 previous powers of attorney and the 3 previous sets of drained accounts. I know about the potassium chloride. The restaurant was quiet. The wine was on the table. The blue ballpoint was in my hand. Vivian looked at me and the warmth was gone. Not gradually, not in stages, but all at once. The way a set designer strikes a set after the final performance. And what was left was not the person who'd brought me coffee and talked about light. What was left was the locksmith, the person who studied locks. She said, what do you want? I said, I want you to continue. She stared at me. I said, I want you to file the marriage license. I want you to open the joint account. I want you to apply for the replacement social security card and the driver's license and the credit cards. I want you to build the identity. I want you to do everything you did before, every step, every document, every transfer. And I want you to do it knowing that I'm watching and that every document you forge, every account you open, every transfer you authorize is being recorded, photographed, and documented by a forensic accountant, a private investigator, and a lawyer who are building a case that will put you in prison for the rest of your life? She said, you're bluffing. I opened my phone. I showed her the photographs. The LLC registration for Meridian Ventures, the sublet agreement for the Industrial Row office, the forged letter to the licensing board, the SS5 application in her handwriting, the bank transaction logs from the first life that Priya had obtained through a subpoena Gerald had filed that morning. I showed her the file on Martin Hale, the death certificate, the marriage license, the power of attorney, the timeline. I showed her the forensic accountant's preliminary report, which connected the 3 previous victims through the same shell company structure, the same banking pattern, the same potassium chloride compound. I showed her the video. Priya had installed a camera in the Lucas reservation system 2 weeks earlier, a tiny lens in the podium angled at table 14. Our table and the video showed Vivian Chen sliding a marriage license across the table and asking a man to sign it. And the video had audio, and the audio captured every word. She stood up. She didn't say anything. She picked up her purse, she looked at me, and her face was the face I'd seen on the bathroom floor. The verification face, the assessment, the locksmith reading the lock. But the lock had changed. The lock was a different lock. The lock was a trap, and she was inside it, and the door was closing. I said, "Sit down." She sat. I said, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out of this restaurant. You're going to go to the police station on Clifton Avenue. You're going to turn yourself in. You're going to hand over every document you've forged, every account you've opened, every piece of identification you've stolen, and you're going to do it tonight. Because tomorrow morning, Gerald Achebe is filing a criminal complaint with the district attorney, and the complaint includes identity theft, bank fraud, credit fraud, forgery, obtaining property by false pretenses, and, based on the death of Martin Hale and the toxicology report that Priya's investigator obtained from the county coroner's archived blood samples, which showed a potassium chloride concentration consistent with deliberate poisoning, murder. Vivian's face did the thing. The blankness, the calculator between operations, the numbers not working. She said Martin Hale died of a heart attack. I said Martin Hale died of potassium chloride poisoning. The original death certificate listed natural causes because nobody tested for it. But the blood samples were retained by the county coroner. They're required to retain samples for 7 years. And Priya's investigator obtained a court order for retesting 3 days ago. The results came back this morning. Potassium chloride, lethal concentration, administered orally, likely in food or beverage, consistent with the compound's taste profile, bitter, almond-like, detectable in strongly flavored dishes. The same compound you put in my pasta on October 30th. She didn't know about October 30th. She didn't know I'd died. She didn't know I'd come back. She didn't know any of that. What she knew was that a man she'd killed 3 years ago had just been retested, and the retest had found poison, and the man sitting across from her, the man she'd been grooming for 11 months, the man she'd designed an entire persona to capture, was holding the results. She went to the police station. She turned herself in at 9:47 p.m. I know because Taurus, the same detective, the same notebook, the same clicking pen, called me at 10 p.m. and said, "Daniel, a woman named Vivian Chen just walked into the station and confessed to identity theft, bank fraud, and the murder of Martin Hale." I said, "I know." Taurus said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I told her to." Taurus was quiet for a long time. She said, "You told a murder suspect to turn herself in," and she did. I said she didn't have a choice. Taurus said, "Everybody has a choice." I said, "Not when the evidence is already filed and the alternative is a manhunt." Taurus said, "You're an unusual man, Daniel Rowe." I said, "I'm an architect. I read the blueprints before I build." The trial took 6 weeks. Gerald presented the evidence. The forged marriage licenses, 3 of them, including mine, though mine was never filed because I hadn't signed. The powers of attorney, the joint bank accounts, the SS5 applications, the credit card fraud, the shell companies, the forged licensing letter, Ichirtuatua. Adeyemi presented the forensic accounting. The $73,200 stolen from me, he attempted, not completed because I'd frozen the accounts. The $89,000 from the pharmacist, the $140,000 from the software developer, the total pattern, $302,000 across 3 victims over 7 years. The prosecution presented the Martin Hale evidence, the retested blood samples, the potassium chloride concentration, the timeline, marriage in February, fraud discovered in October, death in November. The same timeline, the same compound, the same method. The coroner reclassified the cause of death from natural causes to homicide by poisoning. Vivian Wymington was charged with 3 counts of identity theft, 3 counts of bank fraud, 3 counts of forgery, 3 counts of obtaining property by false pretenses, and 1 count of murder in the first degree. Her attorney argued that the Martin Hale death was accidental, an adverse reaction to a dietary supplement. The jury didn't buy it. The potassium chloride was not a dietary supplement. The concentration was not accidental. The timeline was not accidental. The marriage fraud, then poison pattern, was not accidental. It was a method. It was a blueprint. It was the blueprint of a person who studied buildings the way I studied buildings. With precision, with patience, with an eye for the load-bearing wall, she was sentenced to life without parole for the murder of Martin Hale and 18 years for the fraud charges to run consecutively. In the courtroom, after the verdict, she turned to look at me. I was in the second row. Gerald was beside me. Priya was behind me. Torres was in the gallery. Wyoming Tan looked at me the way she'd looked at me on the bathroom floor. The verification faced the assessment, but the assessment was different now. The assessment was the assessment of a person who has just understood that the building she walked into was not the building she thought it was, that the foundation had been replaced, that the walls were different, that the person she targeted, the careful, thorough, lonely architect who read every contract and couldn't read people, had become a person who read both. I went home after the sentencing. Harker Street, my apartment, the gray tile, the cedar soap, the radiator that clanked. I stood in the bathroom where I had woken up, the tile under my feet, the grout lines, the cold, and I pressed my hand flat against the wall, and the wall was solid, and I was alive, and the tile was just tile. I opened the window. The December air came in, cold, clean, smelling of the river and the particular sharp green of the cedar trees along Harker Street. And I stood at the window, and I breathed, and the air was clean, and the bergamot was gone, and the almond was gone, and the only smell was cedar and cold, and the city. I went to the studio the next morning. Clifton Avenue, Row Design Studio, the drawing tables, the model shelves, the south-facing windows that threw the trapezoid of gold across the floor at 3 p.m. from September through March. I stood in the light. I could feel it on my hands, warm, specific, the angle my father had taught me to watch for, the angle that meant the room was alive. I picked up a pencil. I drew a line. The line was straight, and the pencil was sharp, and the paper was smooth under my hand, and the room was quiet, and I was home. The first time I died on a bathroom floor with the taste of almonds in my mouth and the sound of a lock turning and the smell of bergamot over me. The second time, I drank the coffee and didn't drink the coffee. I held the pen and didn't sign with the pen. I let the woman who killed me build her blueprint, the persona, the shell company, the forged documents, the poison, and I built mine first. Mine was deeper. Mine was a trust and a freeze and a camera and a forensic accountant and a lawyer and a private investigator and a retested blood sample from a man who died 3 years before I was born again. Trust isn't weakness. But signing away the right to look twice, that's not trust. That's surrender wearing perfume. Some locks aren't meant to be picked. They're meant to be built by the person who already knows what the locksmith looks like. If this story reminded you of a time someone handed you a pen and said, "Just sign here," or a time you trusted a person who smelled right and said the right words and turned out to be studying you like a blueprint, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want to hear what happens when the person who reads every contract finally starts reading people, subscribe. There's always another story.